Welcome back, everyone, to the Rise Above Heartless Materialism podcast. Today, we have my good friend, Father Evan Winter. Father Winter is a priest in the Lincoln Diocese, which has been said to be the most conservative in the country. I would add that, at least under Bishop Conley's direction, it is conservative in a good way, free from some of the pathologies that sometimes plague, an unbalanced pursuit of that. So it's really great. Father Evan Winter has also celebrated the Latin Mass before, which is a great little insight. And he's just an overall really smart guy. So welcome, Father Evan.
High praise for the diocese there. Let's hope we can hold it up. Anyway, yeah, nice to be here.
Yeah, so today we're going to talk about everybody's favorite topic, which is suffering. The reason I thought about doing a podcast on this topic was actually stemmed from the previous podcast about the SSPX, and the question that briefly came up that did not get really received the full treatment that I would have liked it to have received was, how much suffering should the church impose on its members? And because that seems to be a very, maybe not a defining part, but a big part of like the Trad Novus Ordo, Trad Vatican II, SSPX Vatican II, whatever you want to call it, debates and divides, is how much suffering should the church impose. Now, we all know that suffering is a part of the human condition, even in our modern age, where we've managed to minimize it in many ways compared to previous eras, at least here in the United States. But for as much progress as we've made, we still suffer in various ways. And so one of the ways we suffer is with because of nature. Just a tornado comes through your town and destroys your house, and you're going to have a bit of suffering, especially if it threw a piece of debris at your head. Also, other human beings can just inflict suffering on us. But one of the big questions I want to ask today is, how much suffering should the church impose on us? Which sounds like a horrible question to ask. Why? We already have plenty of suffering in life, so why would you add more to it? And then also, since suffering is part of the human experience, what happens when a society says, no, we're not going to suffer anymore, and attempts to get rid of suffering or evade suffering? So, Father Evan Winter, why is suffering a part of the human experience?
All right. Well, I'm going to be monologuing here for a little bit, if that's all right with you.
Go for it. Less talking I have to do, the better. I'm an introvert.
Yeah. So first of all, I am not a person who in my life has suffered a lot, right? I am not one of those people who you're like, oh my goodness, your life must have been so hard. That's not the kind of life I have. Is my life perfect? Is it completely suffering free? Absolutely not. But I'm not someone who's suffered a ton, right? So if you are here and you're thinking, I really need an answer to why God allows suffering, and I want someone really empathetic who can really understand me and win over my heart, this is probably not the place where you're going to find that, because I haven't had those kinds of experiences. Okay. So just a warning to whoever is listening. Now, do those videos exist? Probably, but this is probably not the one you're looking for. So second, I think we have to understand the Christian relationship with suffering is really complicated. Okay. So first of all, suffering is what we would probably call a natural evil, kind of like death, right? Death is a natural evil. We don't look at someone having died and think, oh, how wonderful they died, right? That's a good thing. No, we think to ourselves, oh, it's sad they died, right? Death is something we avoid. And most of the time, suffering and death are things where we could say, oh, yeah, it is not good that that thing happened in a natural way, right? Now, is there sometimes a time where it's like, okay, I choose suffering or I choose death because of some greater good? Absolutely, right? You can choose to, a soldier who sacrifices their own life to save the lives of others, right, is doing a noble thing, right? Someone who runs into a burning building to get someone out to save their life, knowing that they themselves might die or suffer terrible burns, right? Those people are doing good things, right? But suffering and death, kind of on a basic level, natural evil, we don't default think of those things as good. However, for the Christian, there's another layer on top of this. Excuse me, I was going to say for the Christian. For the Catholic, because I think this gets complicated when you deal with certain forms of non-Catholic Christianity. But for the Catholic, there's another layer to suffering. And that is that because Jesus Christ suffered on the cross for our sins, and he's God and everything, suffering can make us Christ-like, right? A person who suffers can do so, in a sense, in imitation of Christ, or in union with Christ, or something like that. And for the Christian, that makes it something very valuable, right? In many senses, the old simple phrase that some of us remember, "What would Jesus do?" is a great guide for us and what it means to be holy and a good disciple of Jesus Christ. And a good Christian person is like, okay, what would Jesus do? Well, sometimes the answer is Jesus suffers, right? And so, okay, suffering comes to me for whatever reason, in whatever form. To accept that as a way of imitating Christ, as becoming Christ-like, can be a very powerful route to holiness. Now, notice I'm putting in a lot of qualifiers here. There's a lot of can be, all that kind of stuff in there, because there's yet a third side, right? When we're thinking to ourselves, okay, I'm a Catholic, I want to be holy. Well, the big question is, well, who makes you holy, right? And the answer is not, I become holy by my own decisions. The answer is, God makes me holy by a gift of his grace with which I can cooperate or not, right? And so suffering is not just something where we can be like, oh, suffering, I will take it, right? Because if suffering is a way of being Christ-like and holiness is like a gift from God, suffering isn't something that you can just presume to take for yourself, right? It's something where, in a sense, you have to be called to it, or it has to be given to you. It would be, and I think in many cases is, pretentious and prideful to presume to take suffering on oneself when one is not called to it. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. So it seems like the question of suffering, the reality of suffering in the church is often reduced to easy to understand answers, but it's not, because there's a couple realities, maybe three realities. One is that the church has historically, to a greater degree, and still does to a very lesser degree, imposed suffering on its members in the form of penances and, like fasting and abstinence and things of that nature. So that is very real. And then also the many of the saints suffered tremendously. So I think it's easy to look at that and say, oh, well, then we should suffer as much as possible.
Yeah.
The question.
So a few pointers there. So first of all, I personally. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was trying to remember what the. Oh no, the other thing I wanted to bring up is that even the saints, I think most notably like Saint Francis de Sales and then Thomas à Kempis, who is not a saint, have said that sometimes if you take on more than you're ready for, or you could even add to that more than you're called to do, at least at that present moment, then you end up making yourself worse somehow, or even more lax than you were when you started. Um, but that's something you don't hear a lot of. And so what is the case in that, and also, like, why did the church relax its obligatory penances and things like that? And is that a sign of, the church becoming more overall lax, or was there a good reason for it? Which I'm sure there was a good reason for it, but some might dispute that. So
Okay.
anyway.
Yeah. So you're asking like 5 questions in one. I'll try to answer some of them, and if I forget one, you remind me, and we'll go to it. So,
Sounds good.
let's start with that last one. Why did the church change the penance rules? Okay. So, for any of you normal Novus Ordo Catholic listeners out there, a great example of this would be the change in the Friday rules. Right? Catholics now are obliged to abstain from meat on all Fridays during Lent and Ash Wednesday. However, there are people alive today who remember when it was every Friday of the year that you had to abstain from meat, plus some other days too, which, sorry, I can't remember what the other days are.
I think they're Ember days.
Ember days, Rogation days, something like that. Sure.
Yeah.
The rule now is you only have to abstain from meat on Fridays in Lent, Ash Wednesday, and then do some other penance on all the Fridays of the year, and then fast on Ash Wednesday and Good Friday. So those are the current rules, and they're pretty light by historical standards, both speaking recently in the Roman Catholic Church, but then also looking at the Eastern churches, which often have much higher expectations when it comes to fasting. So for the record, I do not think that the change in rules was a good idea. Okay. I know what the minimum is. I'm not going to hold people who I'm responsible to more than the minimum, as a rule, so don't hear this and think that I'm telling you, oh, go keep the old rules on abstinence from meat. I'm not saying that. I don't think they should have changed the rules, but the rules are what they are right now. The reason I don't think they should have changed the rules, by the way, is because of how powerful abstinence on Friday is psychologically for people. I deal with a bunch of, I deal with fallen away Catholics on a fairly regular basis because I'm in a town of 3,000 and I kind of know everybody, right? I know who the fallen away Catholics are. They know that I know, and sometimes we'll even joke about it, for lack of a better word. But the last thing to go for many fallen away Catholics is Friday abstinence during Lent. They'll not be attending Mass on Sundays. They'll, maybe not even have a prayer life, but they will abstain from meat on Fridays and Lent and show up at the fish fry. Okay. Why is this? I do not know, but it is a fact. And for the fact that the U.S. bishops kind of threw that away, I don't think they realized what they were doing. I think their intentions were good, kind of an intention to give people a little more freedom so they could fast from a place of like, oh, I'm doing this out of love for God, rather than because, Big Brother is watching and gonna smite me if I, don't follow the rule. They wanted more freedom. They wanted more love. They wanted more liberty. They wanted, they wanted people to not feel forced, but to do things because of devotion. And that's a great intention. It just didn't work. It's, yeah. So, do I think it was a terrible, terrible, huge misfortune? No, but do I think that they made, in hindsight being 2020, do I think it would have been better to keep the old rules? Yeah, probably, just because, they were good at what they did, and getting rid of them didn't achieve what it was meant to do. So anyway, so there's that. So then let's take a look at the saints, right? You mentioned how a lot of the saints suffered a lot. Okay. So for many of these saints, that was not a choice on their part, right? I think especially of Saint Catherine of Siena, who dealt with intense abdominal pain for several years of her life. And this was the reason she had this abdominal pain was because her father died and she wanted to do something for the repose of his soul. And God said, okay, here you go, and gave her this pain that would not go away. So she's one example. You might think of another example of saints who were bedridden for many years, which, did happen. That's not something they chose. For the saints who did choose their sufferings, they most often, especially in the last 1,000 years, were doing so under the guidance of a spiritual director, right?
Mm-hmm.
They were not going to these penances and being like, I shall do these penances because I must. They were saying to their spiritual director, hey, should I be doing these penances? And the spiritual director, sometimes after, a certain degree of back and forth, said yes. Or, maybe sometimes said no. So that's something to consider with the saints. Another thing to consider with the saints is the saints are human too and made some bad decisions. And some of them may have had some mental illness. There are almost certainly saints who struggled with mental illness, including some of the greats. Okay, so for all you people who are mentally ill out there, there's hope for you, right? You can be saints too. You don't have to be cured to be a saint, although it might help. But someone who's choosing a suffering without a spiritual director, maybe God is guiding them. It also, not every decision the saint made was necessarily a good one. So that's something to keep in mind. What else were you?
Yeah,
what else
that's
did you
great.
ask?
So I had a couple things in mind. So the church has a certain, minimum requirement that it imposes, fasting, penances, etc., on its members. Before it was more austere, now it's not. Maybe it was a better idea, or maybe it wasn't such a good idea to relax that at least as much. Fair enough. But the question is the gap between that and what the saints did is often, pretty high, so, or pretty large. So what kind of principle is the church operating under when it says, okay, this is the level that we're going to impose on you, but the ideal that the saints did is up here? So I guess a question one might ask is oh, well, the saints did, the saints fasted on bread and water for 40 days, or went without food for 40 days. So why should that not be imposed on everybody? And I'm picking such an exaggerated question. I don't think anybody would even ask, but I'm trying to uncover the principle. So
Sure.
so in other words, somebody might say, oh, well, instead of rolling back to the penances of 1962, why not roll back to the penances of 1800 or 300 or something, whenever it was higher? Or why not make confession more difficult, where you can only confess once in your lifetime, and you have to do it before the whole church, or things like that. So the question is I think it's easy to look at these, sometimes, and for a certain set of people, it's easy to look at this from a question of well, why not make it as difficult as possible?
Sure.
And the more difficult it is, the more purer and more holier it is, kind of thing. So can you, it's kind of a bit of a nebulous question in there. Maybe you can.
I mean, I think
one
thing you have to keep in mind is that the church's rules are meant to apply to a wide variety of people, right? Mm-hmm. And so, you're having, it's hard, the rule for fasting, for example, I think kicks in at 16, I think it is. Mm-hmm. So, and it goes till someone is 59, right? So you're dealing with both, post fertile women and teenage male athletes, right? And they're supposed to, in a sense, live under the same rule, in a sense.
Mhm.
And so there has to be kind of a minimum that works for everybody that the rule is supposed to apply to. So that's one thing to consider. Another thing to consider is that the saints, many of the saints that we think of as big sufferers, lived in very different times from ours. And those times were not always different only in ways that made, uh, you know, their lives harder. So, for example, I was talking with an Eastern Orthodox priest about this and the Eastern Orthodox rules of fasting. And he said something very interesting. He said the rules that the Eastern Orthodox Church uses for fasting and Lent are not designed for people living in cold climates.
Mm.
That, this diet that they have of like beans and nuts and vegetables and all that stuff, and no dairy and no olive oil and all that stuff, is designed for people who are living in an area where like it rarely gets below freezing, right? Think of, this is Turkey, this is Greece,
Right.
this is Syria. I remember I did a Lent, this last Lent, actually I did a Lent where I did a lot of fasting. This was under the direction of my spiritual director, by the way. I was cold all the time. Like,
Mm.
it wasn't that I was hungry all the time. It was that I was cold. It's like, this probably would have been a lot easier if I lived in southern Italy or Cadiz, Spain, or
Yeah.
Fatima, Portugal, or Guadalajara, Mexico, like, where it's like, oh, like, okay, I'm hungry, but like the heat actually isn't hitting me too bad. I'm a nice, comfortable temperature. It's like, here I
Mhm.
am in Nebraska where it's like 40 on a good day. It's like, I'm cold no matter what I do, right? And like, it was fine. It was bearable, but it gives us a nice illustration of like, you know, some of these saints were dealing with conditions that are a little different from ours. Here's another difference, right? Is the kind of work that we do. If you're doing a really strict abstinence where you're eating a lot of grains, a lot of bread, a lot of that kind of stuff, that works really well if you're doing a lot of manual labor. If you're a farmer, you're planting the fields, you're spending a lot of energy, eat all the bread you want, right? But for those of us who live in the United States, like, we don't spend that many calories. And so like it is harder for us to get the other nutrients that we need, if we're, you know, living under some of the dietary restrictions, unless we're
Mhm.
willing to like eat tons of calories and like gain weight during a penitential season, and put ourselves at risk for diabetes, like,
Yeah.
there's there's a lot of differences here. um I think also, I'd be interested to see, like, this is probably a question for like a neuroscientist, right? But like, we do a lot more brain work and a lot less body work, like, how has that affected what kinds of foods we need to work well,
Mhm.
like, um I imagine a medieval peasant didn't really care if they got enough vitamin B12, like, as long as they weren't having health problems. But for us, it's like some people, they don't get enough vitamin B12 and they like can't think straight, like,
Yeah.
and it's not their fault, is that they have to do more thinking as part of their job. So, so there's a lot of changing factors in play where it's like, okay, the desert hermits of Egypt did this. Yeah, the desert hermits of Egypt were also living in a place where it's always hot
Mhm.
and doing manual labor and praying. Like, like, that actually makes some kinds of penance ironically easier.
Mhm.
Not all of them. And I'm not saying our lives aren't easy, are like harder than theirs, because they're not, right? But like, you can't just take what they did and be like, oh, this will work great for me.
Mhm.
um
Yeah. Yeah. So it's so but there are also like, are there, I've heard that there's a lot of like exceptions to fasting in like the for the Eastern. on
Oh, sure.
an individual basis, for
Oh
example.
yeah, for
Like,
sure. Yeah, they're not, they have a high standard, but they don't expect everyone to live up to it.
right.
Like that's I think another thing is like we hear these stories of like, saints or people or traditions in the church who suffered who took on a lot of penances. It's like, okay, but how many people back then were getting exceptions? We get
Mhm.
the rule. We don't necessarily hear about the exceptions, because
Right.
those make the historical data look a lot less impressive, probably.
I know for me, I grew up doing meatless Fridays all year round, and I would
Same,
continue
yeah.
that, but then I got put on an anti-inflammation diet, and I felt, shall we say, less capable when I ate tuna instead of my normal diet on a Friday.
Interesting. Okay.
So since in the United States anyway, under the current law, you can substitute a penance. I've heard some
Uh-huh.
people say that actually you don't have to do any penance, like it was completely done away with.
That's not true.
I didn't think it was, but people say things on the internet. So I decided to give up Facebook instead, with some exceptions for like
Mhm.
pressing work related kind of postings in that regard.
Yeah.
I actually find that to be a harder penance for me,
Yeah. Yeah.
because
Yep.
I
Yep.
use Facebook so much, and so
Mhm.
and it's addicting,
Mhm.
so you take it away and it's like, oh, so tough.
Right.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's like, okay, I don't think you're approaching this with the right attitude. Other times it's been like, yeah, you feel called to do this. I'm not seeing any red flags. Go for it.
Mhm.
Um, you know, but in a certain sense, they're not claiming it on their own. They're bringing it up as an idea, and then it's being given to them.
Mhm.
Um,
So what would you
so
say, let's expound on that. What would you say to somebody who wants to, they're like, yeah, they see, for example, the life of Saint Catherine of Siena or Saint Gemma Galgani, and they say, wow, they suffered so much for Christ, and they want to do something more. Like, what? How can they go about it in a way that doesn't harm them spiritually? Um, could there also be like other things they might want to focus on instead of a penance at a particular time, like, or maybe things that they maybe should attend to first?
uh-huh.
And is it possible to have too much penance?
Yeah, I mean it's definitely possible for an individual person to have too much penance in the sense of like they take on one that they're not supposed to have, and it leads them into pride or burnout or something like that, right?
Hmm.
So it's also possible to have too much penance in the sense of it kills you. Like if you
Yeah.
do penance and if you do a penance that kills you, that was too much. Um, so those are some things. I think if someone has a spiritual director, that should always be their first step, right? Like, okay, I feel called to do a penance. Let me go over it with my spiritual director, right? If someone doesn't have a spiritual director, asking their spouse if they have one, I think is probably a great place to start. Asking their pastor if their pastor isn't the sort of person that's like, oh, you don't have to do that. Penances are, from the past. We don't do that anymore. Which I think most pastors probably would not be that way. Although you never know. I think too, like if those options aren't really available to you, you can't get a meeting with your pastor, your spouse doesn't really have an opinion, or you don't have a spouse, you don't have a spiritual director, blah 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 blah. I think you know doing it with people is really good, right? I know it sounds so mainstream, but I've done Exodus 90 twice now, and the fact that you're doing it not by yourself is a huge part of what makes it work, right? Because then you're not under any illusions of like, oh, look how great I am,
Mm,
rather it's oh wow, I have this supportive community that is really helping me you know do this hard thing, and I have people who I in a sense have to humble myself for before when I don't do it right, um
mm,
you know so I'm not saying everybody should go and do it, because that's obviously more complicated than that, but I do think that that's in a sense been a tool that's been a safe way, for lack of a better word, to introduce people to some harder penances in a way that's gonna, oh, the word escapes me, minimize, there we go, minimize the downsides, um, because you have a community, you have a plan that you don't go beyond, it's like, okay, you do these things,
mhm.
and as many of my friends have loved to point out, smoking is not, giving up smoking is not on there. Um, and there is, even if it's not your personal spiritual director, it's always done kind of under the guidance of a spiritual father who kind of runs the program, does the meditations, that kind of thing. Um, like, I'm not saying everyone who's doing it is doing it for the right reasons, but it certainly helps when you have some of those other things in place to keep the sense of pride, to keep the sense of I'm doing this because I want to claim holiness for myself or because I hate myself. It's really keeping that kind of stuff at a minimum, I think.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So suffering is one of those things that we all have this, I think we all have this intrinsic, inherent, visceral feeling that I shouldn't have to suffer. Like something is wrong, and why am I suffering? Um, but at the same time, it's obvious that suffering is a part of what makes us human. So can you talk a little bit to that kind of paradox there?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's, in a sense, how to suffering being a part of what makes us human. I think there's kind of three parts to this. So first of all, there was the whole original sin thing, right?
Right.
The punishments for sin are, what are they? Pain in childbirth, strain in relationships, weeds and thorns in agriculture, death, which also includes things like sickness, and then strife and all that stuff, right? So you know, part of this is just, okay, we're sinners, we live in a sinful world, suffering is gonna happen, right? That's part of it. Second part, and this part I think is a little maybe underappreciated in the Christian world, but I think is makes a lot of sense from a philosophical point of view. I think it's St. John Henry Newman. I'm not entirely sure on this, but he says, to live is to change, and to be perfect is to have changed often, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, if you want to live, you have to constantly be changing, right? We eat and then we poop, right? Like, that's change, right? A child grows, a person who wants to have it be in good shape has to exercise and change their body, right? And that's great, but matter resists change, right? Like,
Mm,
if you want to turn wood into fire, you have to convince the wood, for lack of a better word, to become fire by making a spark, by heating the wood up till it reaches that point of it just kind of goes, right? But like, matter resists change. And so in many senses, I think suffering is just is not just, but in many cases, suffering is the resistance to the change, the changes that we need, right? Um,
mm,
um, which I think is another reason why sometimes taking on suffering of one's own accord is a little dicey, because it's like, how do I know what changes I really need?
mm.
Like,
That's a good point.
who is that wise? Like, it's one
Yeah.
thing if it's like, oh, I I want to be more loving. So I'm going to practice acts of love, which there's some suffering included in that because it's a change, right? Okay,
Hmm.
that's one thing. But it's like, oh, I want to love. Therefore, I'm going to make myself suffer so I can love better. It's like that. There's so many other like details in there. How do you expect to keep track of them all without like God basically leading you along? Like
You bring up love and charity. Is it true that some of the saints have said that it can actually be better to focus on doing your daily duties well and loving the people around you, more
instead
so
of
that
what?
is more so than taking on, for example, like a physical kind of penance, like
Oh, for sure,
hair
for sure.
shirt or fasting so much that your daily duties suffer, or flagellating yourself. Of course, nobody does any of those things. I won't say nobody, but most Catholics probably don't do any of those things today. Um, but I think there could be kind of an allure to those sorts of things because they're not practiced today. And anyway,
Yeah.
so
I mean, think of a a married man or a person with children, right? Their vocation is clear. They have a spouse, they have children. Taking care of these people is clearly a part of their vocation. They don't need to, in a sense, ask for permission, right? A given penance is not nearly so clearly a part of their vocation. It might be, but it also might not, right? And so
mhm,
to put your energy into a penance when you have people around you to take care of is like, you're giving up you're running the risk of losing something that's clearly part of what God wants you to do for the sake of something that, you know, is not nearly as clear. Um, so yeah.
yeah, absolutely. What do you think the attitude toward suffering in the world is today, both inside the church, outside the church, and among different factions in the church? I think I kind of loaded the question a little bit at the beginning, but I'd love to hear in your own words.
I mean, I think out in the world, and I'm not as world negative as some people out there. People have a really, really low tolerance for suffering. Um, like they don't handle it well. But I think part of the reason they don't handle it well is that they don't know what to do with it.
Hmm.
Because I think if you ask those same people, like if you told them the story of someone like, like they love stories of people who've like overcome great odds, like someone gets up on stage who like has to use a computer to talk because someone tore their voice box out, like,
Hmm.
people love that kind of stuff. And not because they love looking at people in pain, but because they admire those people, right? Or like, you hear the story, like you hear the story of like, oh yeah, this athlete trained for hours and hours and hours to be where they are today, right? Like even people who handle suffering super badly, they love that stuff, right? um and so like sure, are people wimps? Yeah, but like part of that might just be that they don't have a sense of purpose, and suffering comes and it
Hmm.
just feels like this pointless pain that's just like, I have to deal with this, and it's not just unpleasant, but it's utterly meaningless to them,
Yeah.
and that's probably the worst part of it. It's like how meaningless it feels.
Right.
um you know
Yeah. When you have
um
a worldview that
uh
says that suffering, not only is it evil, but we can do away with it.
mhm.
So I think there's this feeling of injustice of like why am I suffering? I shouldn't be suffering. It's somebody's fault that I'm suffering. And we could make a better world. It's just some people are too whatever negative attribute you want to give to them. And if we just did away with those people, or if we just restructured things, then suffering would go away.
And to be clear, suffering often is someone else's fault. Like,
sure, but
we don't want to deny that. It's like a lot of the suffering in the world is precisely because somebody did a bad thing, right? There's two different versions of the problem of evil, right? There's like, why does God allow the innocent to suffer, right? And then there's the older version, which is, why does God not smite the wicked sooner? And the answer to that second question is because, well, if he did, we would all be dead.
We'd all be dead, yeah.
We all fit into that category at least sometimes. So,
yeah.
So anyway,
so even though we admire those stories, those out in the world admire those stories that you mentioned of people overcoming adversity in order to, make a better life or pursue some kind of excellence. For those that still have a rejection of, or an inability to suffer, what kind of problems in society does that cause?
I mean, it makes them miserable,
Yeah.
I think that's the most important problem, is that people who can't handle suffering are miserable because the slightest thing makes them deeply unhappy.
Mm-hmm.
It's like if you could be, I was on a plane that ended up being delayed by like 3 hours. Like we had to sit on the plane for like 3 extra hours because of weather related reasons, and had to land in one city and then go back to the other city. And like, there were people on the plane who were like barely holding it together. And it's like, it's like, I feel bad for you, like,
Yeah.
and I know that for some of them, like there was one guy who was like afraid he would miss a family funeral. And it's like, okay, yeah, that's a big deal, but it's a 3-hour plane delay. Like it's not that bad.
Mm-hmm.
But like, when a 3-hour plane delay makes your life intolerable for 3 hours, like that might predispose you to some stupid decisions.
Mm.
And to be clear, I didn't see anybody on that plane actually make a really stupid decision, right? But it's like, if this is all the tolerance you've got for this kind of thing, something slightly worse happens, you could go full on, meet me out in the park at 3 a.m. and we'll shoot it out, like.
Yeah. Well, I think as you pointed out, some people have different, this is a bit of a tangent, different pressures. That a 3-hour flight for some people would be a walk in the park. Others, it could be a major disruption. I think of somebody like who has maybe they have a job interview, maybe they've been striking out for months and they have to get to where they're going on time, or they'll miss that job interview. And that's an interesting concept with
right. And like,
it's kind of like the treadmill of society, like, and maintaining society. Like, so many people are just like, so many of us are like a thread away from just existential collapse. Like the dad who is barely making ends meet to support his family of 5 or whatever. And if, his health goes just a little bit too bad, he might be on the list of layoffs. And if you're in a bad economy, then how's he going to find work? And, the modern world is very much kept in place by a sort of like desperation.
Which is another thing to keep in mind when it comes to historical saints and their penances, is we act like there's less suffering in the world now. I'm not so sure that's true.
Yeah.
For precisely the reasons you're describing. It's like,
a different kind of suffering.
Yeah. 2 hours is most of the time not going to make the difference between riches and ruin in the medieval world.
Yeah.
Unless the clouds are literally gathering on the horizon, the hay will last out in the field 2 more hours, uh, most of the time, right? But
Mhm.
like, but we live in a world where like 2 hours might be the difference between riches and ruin for someone. And I sounded kind of judgy when I was talking about the plane there, because who knows how many people on the plane were dealing with that. I was just like, I was sitting there, I was coming back from vacation. I didn't have anywhere I needed to be, and where
Right.
it was like that big of a difference. But I was like, how miserable would I be if I just had to sit here with this suffering and I had nothing to do with it, you
Right.
know?
I think your assessment is, I mean, I think maybe it's 50-50. Like, there are definitely people who are like super busy and maybe have important things, and that kind of a delay could just be catastrophic. But then I think there probably is no shortage of people who are just like, oh, well, I have to wait in the airport now for 3 hours, and instead of just being like, well, there's nothing I can do about it, I'm gonna go scream to the manager or something, and try and make somebody else's life miserable. And I think that's really, generally speaking, that I think is the inhumanity of a refusal to accept the suffering you're dealt with.
Yeah. But when the
Is
suffering,
you go out then and you find somebody else to blame for your suffering, or even if you don't intentionally do that, like you just naturally are more inclined to make everybody else suffer. Like, okay, I don't want to suffer, therefore it's your fault, and I'm gonna, you know, pour on my frustration and abuse on you because I shouldn't be suffering, and I think that making you suffer is somehow going to alleviate that when it's not. And you mentioned, I think too, is we think of suffering and even the penances imposed as somehow restrictive and coercive and even a form of slavery. But the great paradox is the more you're able to suffer, the freer you become, because and I said, like you, like, I mean, it sounds like you're doing more penance than I am, but uh
not
i
at the
i,
moment.
I don't want to suffer. I
I'm
thought,
not living a very penitential life at the moment. It's
yeah, but you
the
do
middle
things
of
like,
July in a rural parish. My life's pretty good.
well, during Lent anyway, you do more penance than I do, let's put it that way. um but like, I have a terror of surgery. I'm terrified of surgery. I've never had like substantial surgery in my life, and I don't want it to happen because I know it's a miserable thing, and I don't know, so much can go wrong. But because I'm not willing to accept the suffering that might entail, it's kind of a form of slavery, of fear and anxiety. So I think that, and so many people are suffering from anxiety today, and it could be a variety of reasons. It could be glyphosate in the food. It could be too much sugar, but I think at least an ingredient in that is, we don't want to suffer, and the less suffering you want to do, the more terrifying life becomes. And I'm speak from personal experience. I don't want to drive on I-80 in Omaha because I'm terrified of the stress that would be induced from trying to not have to trying to keep from a wreck caused by all the crazy drivers. And of course, to be fair, Omaha has repeatedly been named as the city with the worst drivers in the country, so maybe it's not just me, but just things like that. So but another thing I wanted to touch on too is, we see the example of the saints and how much they suffered, and I think it can be easy to like, and then look up to them as an ideal for sure. But I think, I wonder if for some it might be easy to say, oh, well, if they suffered that much, then I have to suffer that much, and I have to make myself suffer that much. In that regard, I think of the litany of humility. At the very end, it says that others may become holier than I, provided that I become as holy as I should. And if God wants you to suffer like Saint Gemma Galgani, then the path there is going to bring fruit, good fruit. If he doesn't want you to suffer as much as Saint Gemma Galgani, well, then the path there is probably going to be pretty vicious. Does that sound like a fair assessment, or
Well, I
would you
think,
add anything?
I think everyone should read novels and everyone should attempt to write novels, and it'll help you with this. And here's why, right? You're reading your novel. We'll take Lord of the Rings here because I think the answer is probably going to be pretty clear. Who's your favorite Lord of the Rings character? If you had to pick just one, who's your
Galadriel.
favorite? Galadriel.
Galadriel.
Oh, okay. This
Bad
is not
example.
working. This example is not going the way I was hoping. Okay.
Maybe you should say which of my favorite characters in the Fellowship. I think I know where you're going with this. Should I pick one in the Fellowship?
Which of the characters in the Fellowship is your favorite?
I think it's a tie between Gandalf and Frodo.
Okay. Once again, this example is not going the way I was hoping. Have you ever met someone whose favorite Lord of the Rings character was Bilbo Baggins?
I don't know if I've met anybody who's talked about him being their favorite character. I remember watching a video about a homeless guy once talking about Bilbo Baggins leaving his home and his comfort and all that sort of thing. But that's the closest I've ever gotten.
Okay. Have you ever met someone whose favorite character in Lord of the Rings was like Merry or Pippin?
I don't think so. I haven't really talked to a lot of people about who their favorite Lord of the Rings character was.
I guess my point with this is that, like, okay, you're writing a story, you're making a story. Your favorite character is not necessarily the most virtuous character in the story, right?
Oh, yeah.
Which is why when you kept saying Galadriel, Gandalf, Frodo, I was like, this is not working.
Frodo works.
Frodo kind of works, sure, yeah.
In the end, he took the ring for himself.
Yeah, okay. Frodo's weak and whiny, and Frodo also had to deal with carrying the addictive substance when no one else was carrying it for months and months at a time. Like, he had to deal with a lot of stuff, right? So, but like my point is that the favorite character in the story is not necessarily the most virtuous character in the story, right? And so, like, God's writing a story, right? You're in it, you're a character in his story, right? Like, you don't need to, you might need to be Therese of Lisieux, but you also might not need to be Therese of Lisieux.
Right.
So, like looking at the saints and being like, oh, I need to become like that saint. Like, well, no, you need to become like the kind of saint who you're supposed to be. They can give you lessons, they can give you inspiration. Sometimes you might be called to follow their example of suffering, but like, that's kind of hard to know in advance.
Yeah.
I think too, like, the saints we miss because most of us haven't read 200, 300, 500 page biographies of our favorite saints, right? I'm putting I too have not read 500-page biographies of all my favorite saints, right? But they grow gradually too. It's not like they will. It's pretty rare to find a saint who wakes up one morning and like all of a sudden is in their final form of holiness, right?
Right.
It's a much more gradual transformation. I mean, like, you've read Story of a Soul, I hope, right?
I read most of it a long time ago. I think I got to like the last, I don't know, 50 pages, 20 pages.
Saint Therese of Lisieux, greatest saint of modern times. Big fan of what's his name? Dom Prosper Guéranger, for all those trads out there who care about such things. She was a fan of his liturgical writings. Her family would read them as like bedtime reading because, of course they did, right? Great, wonderful, traditional saint, one of the holiest saints ever. And she's like a whiny brat for half of her life, like, and all of her, her big moments of transformation, none of them are ones that she could have planned. right?
Yeah.
You probably remember the story with the shoes. Do you remember that story from her biography?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like there is no way she could have chosen that moment for herself. God had to give
Hmm.
it to her, right?
Yeah.
Or the other moment, the moment with the annoying nun in the cloister. There is no way she could have made that happen on her own.
Yeah.
Like God had to give that to her, right?
Yeah.
Um, and she's the greatest saint of modern times. And here are people thinking, oh, I should try to, force myself to become like Saint Anthony of the Desert. It's like he didn't live in modern times. Nobody called him the greatest saint of modern times. You're not him. And who do you think you are to force yourself to be like him anyway? Like these things are a gift from God.
That is a fantastic point, I think. And I think if on the one side of the spectrum we have the idea of I don't want to suffer at all, and I'm going to make everybody else suffer instead of me suffering. I think on the flip side, we have the great trap of I will make myself holy like the saints.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And usually what happens is I will also bully other people around me into becoming holy like the saints instead of, no, I will let God make me holy and respond to him as best I can.
Sometimes it even, yeah. The weird parts is the times when it actually works, because
Okay. Well,
sometimes
what
God
actually
is like,
works?
sometimes God is like, they're trying. I'll bless that.
Hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I would say generally you are right that
Well, and some of the saints didn't they start out kind of that? Didn't Saint Ignatius kind of start out with a I will make myself holy kind of disposition, and then that didn't work out so well?
I'm not. That sounds right, but I don't know enough to say for sure. Um,
Well,
trying to think of,
didn't he try to take on like a lot of penances, and then later he said, "Oh well, there's actually a more like reasonable and
mhm.
humble way to go
Like I
about
said,
this."
that sounds right. I just don't remember if
Yeah.
you have the right person in mind.
Okay.
Um, yeah, I think an example that I love that I am reasonably certain is true is Saint Teresa of Avila, right?
Mm,
When Saint
okay.
Teresa of Avila was a little child, she decided she wanted to be a martyr. And so she started walking south toward the Islamic part of Spain so that she could get martyred. Um, and her family put a stop to that real quick, right? You know, uh, and and later on, when she becomes the saint who she actually becomes, the great Carmelite reformer, um, I think there's you read her autobiography, there's a much stronger sense of like, not that she didn't make choices because she absolutely did, right? But there's a much stronger sense of like this was something she and God were doing together, right?
Mm,
She
mm,
was not, you know, she wasn't taking her own holiness into her own hands. She and God
right.
were doing it together. She was taking the Carmelite order into her own hands, for God's sake. uh, I mean, she was giving it to God, right? She wasn't doing anything without God, right? But
Right.
like, she was making choices, but she was always doing it with God, not just kind of on her own.
Right.
Um, trying to think of another good example of a saint who was um, maybe a little too invest trying to do it themselves rather than letting God do it. um, um, Saint Gregory the Great, here's another example. Saint Gregory the Great said many times he would have preferred to just stay in the monastery, right? Like I would say
Mm,
insofar as he made choices that were just of his own accord, it would have been to be a monk. That's obviously not what God wanted for him, right?
right.
He's not just a pope, he's one of the great popes,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or if you want a more biblical example, St. Peter. St. Peter is a great example of someone who, in a sense, tries to take their holiness into their own hands. Lord, even if I will die with you, I will never deny you. You know,
Mm,
um, Pulling out the sword, cutting off the slave's right ear. you
Yeah.
know, trying to tell Jesus not to die on the cross, and Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." Right? Peter is someone who's trying to take his holiness into his own hands. And what image does Jesus actually use for his holiness? It's like someone will dress for you and lead you where you do not want to go.
Right.
And stretch out your hands for you, um, you know, so um, these are all examples of it. Now, I would love it if someone listening to this podcast or watching this podcast, if God leads you to become the next Saint Anthony of the Desert or something like that. Oh, that would be wonderful, right?
Mm-hmm.
But
Absolutely.
God has to take you there.
Right. Yeah, and that's the see, I've noticed when you try to account for the entirety of truth and the fullness of reality, it's harder to be, you have to go a lot slower and be a lot less passionate, if that makes any sense.
Passionate in a certain kind of conventional sense, yeah.
Right. Like, in other words, it's the great temptation, I think, in our time is to break apart paradoxical and big truths into a tiny fragment and then just say, yes, this is it. And you wrap your fist around it, and then you become the master of it instead of it becoming master of you. I know that sounds very like woo and vague, but
I think I got you. I got you.
yeah, and I wonder if we do that about suffering sometimes. On the one hand, you've got people who say, oh, well, a good God would never let me suffer, therefore there is no God. It's like, oh, well, you're just trying to like break that mystery apart into something that you can wrap your head around. And then you have, on the other hand, the people are just like, oh, well, yeah, we just all need to suffer more, and we need to like make everybody suffer the same. And like, well, and especially when they say, oh, well, you're not a real Catholic if you don't suffer at this level, kind of thing. I think that's definitely taking a piece of that truth and just trying to wrap your head around it.
Yeah, at the same time, I think, uh, for lack of a better word, obedience covers a multitude of potential errors here. Because I think,
Mm-hmm.
like, let's say you have someone who's young and really enthusiastic, and they're like, "Oh, I really want to do this and this and this and this." Like, you know, there's a fine line between like keeping that person from doing anything stupid and not quenching the not quenching the smoldering reed, to use a scriptural phrase.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like, okay, like if someone comes to me with this enthusiasm and is like, hey, I want to do this and this and this and this, I'm kind of like, okay, and then I kind of watch them crash and burn. Well, at least they have a safe place to come back to.
Right.
Can you imagine how awful it would be if they did all that on their own? And then
Yeah.
they're like, oh, it didn't work. I'm going to go become an atheist now or whatever.
Right. Right.
And I'm not, I think there's, this is why the people in charge need lots and lots of wisdom, because it's like, okay, when do you kind of let the fire burn and see what happens? And when do you be like, hold back,
Yeah.
Um,
Zeal and wisdom, two opposing poles that need each other. Because on the one hand, if there was no such thing as youthful zeal, well, then nobody would go fight just wars or wars in general. There'd be no soldiers. There probably would be nobody getting married, because if people knew what either of those truly entailed, I don't think anybody would do it. And I think we're seeing that right now, particularly with marriage, is people see all these
how hard
failed.
it is.
Yeah, and because we're more learned now, people understand that. Speaking of marriage, I think, against my will, because the algorithm doesn't always show me what I consciously choose. I see all of a sudden I'm starting to see everywhere this sort of the gender wars where men are like, oh, well, she's just too entitled and whiny and naggy, so women are all that way, so they're all evil, so I'm not going to have anything to do with them. And then women are just like, oh, well, he's not a man, he's not giving me everything I want, kind of thing, and men are just stupid. And to me, like, the issue on both sides is neither side wants to suffer. They're looking at the opposite sex as an object of use instead of an object of sacrificial love. And of course, is what I'm seeing actually reflective of the greater population? Who knows? Because sometimes social media likes to take extreme cases and just, throw them out there for clickbait. But, the statistics show that fewer and fewer people are getting married, and you have to wonder if that's the reason why, is because we're looking at, we don't want to suffer for the sake of the other person.
I mean, that might be part of it. I mean, there's a certain and marriage is a sacrament, which means there must be some kind of act of faith required.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the biggest acts of faith that you can do is, we're going to be open to another person and open to life when we're not sure exactly how we're going to afford it, either, monetarily or emotionally. Like there's faith involved there. So, I am not proposing to solve the gender wars in 15 minutes. I think that would be a quixotic at best, which doesn't mean it's not worth doing, but it would be quixotic. I saw someone pointed out recently that men and women have always said these kinds of things about each other. This is not new. No. What's new is that the opposite sex is aware of the things that are being said about them because it's being done on social media.
Interesting.
Men making jokes about their wives is as old as the hills. Probably literally, you could probably find a cuneiform tablet from ancient Sumeria that has jokes about a man's wife on it, and I can only presume that women were saying much the same things, just it didn't get written down as often. But social media kind of puts these things on display for all to see. So that, for the first time in history, men know exactly what women think of them, and women know exactly what men think of them. It's and they can't, and there's no joking to it either. Like I think back in the time before social media, oftentimes it was like, yeah, people would laugh because they knew it was kind of true, but also kind of funny. Like it wasn't, like the things that they said about each other were supposed to be funny, but like nothing, it's you can't tell the tone in which a text message is written,
Right. Well, I can tell you the tone of the videos, and
but you don't know the person sending it. You don't really know the person sending it. You don't know if they're really cynical or if they're more funny. Like there's just so much about the people you don't know, and so people assume the worst. And then, as you have duly noted, people love to get outraged. It's a little harder to get outraged when the person is making the joke right in front of you, and you can see the smile on their face, and you can see in their eyes that they don't actually hate you. It's a little harder to be outraged when that's the kind of joke you're dealing with. So.
Indeed. Well, we've covered a lot of ground, I think, in a short amount of time.
Hopefully I haven't fallen into heresy at any point. If I did, I
think I'm more likely to fall into heresy before you are.
I mean, a degree in theology will do that to you.
I hope so. Otherwise, why study theology? But But of course, even theologians disagree about what's heresy. People who've been
No doubt.
theologians their whole lives. One side says one thing, the other side. Speaking of that, is it true that there was a case in church history when the Pope said one thing and a whole bunch of theologians disagreed with him, and then eventually the theologians were vindicated and the Pope was in error? Does that sound right?
It would depend on how definitive of a papal statement you were looking for. Back during one of the Christological controversies back in the early church, and I forget which one it was exactly. I want to say it was the Nestorian controversy, but I'm not entirely sure. There was a pope who, in a letter, expressed an opinion about the two natures of Christ, which was probably heretical, right?
Mm-hmm.
But but number one, the statement did admit of multiple interpretations. It was ambiguous, so it could be interpreted in an orthodox way. So that was one part of the problem. The second part was that it wasn't an overly authoritative communication, right? This was not the Pope clearly making an infallible statement. This was the Pope doing something less than that. Like, problematic, confusing, sure, but certainly not a case of theologians winning over an authoritative, infallible statement from the Pope.
Right.
I would say, like even something like Humani Vitae, the fact that the Pope was right and the dissenting theologians were wrong was far clearer in the state of Humani Vitae than, there was not nearly that much clarity in the case of this Nestorian papal letter thing. I don't remember which pope it was. I'm sorry. I didn't know this question was coming.
I didn't have it written down. We're in spontaneous territory right now.
Oh, yay. I'm a P. I love that.
A receiving type. I am a judging type, but I'm learning to roll with the punches the more I realize that I have to do more and worry about perfection less. What about the we're going on a complete tangent here. The documents of Vatican II, is it true most of them are pastoral, and there's like, what is it, 2 of them are, I forget what the term is, but basically like have higher weights of assent? That one is.
So there's 2 that have the word dogmatic in their title. Dogmatic Constitution.
Dogmatic Constitution, yes.
So maybe there's more than 2. The liturgy one, is that a dogmatic? I don't remember. Anyway, but some of them clearly have dogmatic in the name. I would say for all the documents, none of the documents have defining clearly what is heresy and what isn't as their primary purpose.
Right.
Which is a difference from many previous councils. Trent very clearly defined what is heresy, what isn't. But Trent also had passages that were also very clearly not doing that, right? Things that they did. So for example, the part of Trent that is still very applicable for us today, requiring that priests be trained in seminaries. Okay, this is something coming out of Trent. It is not coming out of any kind of like, this is a dogma of the church, because it's clearly not, right? But here we have Trent, a council that very clearly deals with dogmas, also doing things that aren't dogmatic. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay.
So Vatican II, there's not a single document in Vatican II that I would say has as its primary purpose defining dogmas. Right. That doesn't mean that there aren't dogmas in there. So I wouldn't. I think I cannot off the top of my head think of a single statement of Vatican II that would certainly qualify as infallible. However, that doesn't mean they're not there. It just means I can't think of any.
Right. Well, as I said in my previous podcast, I think the Pope Benedict's concept of hermeneutic of continuity just makes the most sense ever.
Yeah, I would agree with you there. That's typically what happens when Benedict would get involved. Is things would make more sense once he was done with them. That was kind of a special gift of his.
Yes, it
Nice.
was. I need to read more of his work then, because goodness knows we need more sense in our time.
And probably also more nonsense. We probably need more of both.
That's probably true too.
What we don't need more of is something that kind of makes sense, and but yeah.
Yeah, we don't. I'm not sure how to describe that.
Vague and
Because
imprecise. We don't need more vague and imprecise thinking. We need vagueness and imprecision belongs to poetry. We keep it where it belongs.
well, that's my realm. That must be why I'm very vague and imprecise. So maybe I should. That's why hopefully I leave the theologizing to my guests. So on that note, I think I'm getting a little sleepy.
Okay.
Thank you again for this very very insightful, very densely packed podcast.
Yes, we got through a lot in an hour
we
and
did.
a half.
We did, yes, indeed. I forgot to mention at the beginning of the podcast, you're also a composer of music. Do you have any works online, any works anywhere that any of our guests can
yes.
view?
I do actually have a YouTube channel. It's very small, but I do.
How do I not know about this?
Probably because a lot of my videos are private, but they're not all private. Let me see if I can find the YouTube channel for you. I do hope to put more things on it in the future, especially since I'll be finishing up my master's degree in music hopefully this fall, and I don't want to just pretend like my music doesn't exist once I'm done. So hopefully more things will be going on there. I'm looking for the link to the YouTube channel so that I can put it in I can email it to you or something.
Do you know the name of the channel offhand?
Something boring like my name.
Oh, okay. Well, we will send it to me, and I will put a link in the description.
Okay, sounds good. I will make that happen. So
all right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again, and thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share if you found this interesting, comment with all your glowing affirmations and caustic disagreements and so forth, as the internet does.
And I know that he usually gets trad trolls, but if we could get some non-trad trolls on here,
what?
Just for fun,
I only got one.
Just to add some variety, let's get some non-trad trolls on here.
Oh man, like a certain Pope-splainer that I'm familiar with.
Oh, I was thinking more of a certain mutual friend of ours with a nose ring, but
what? Okay.
With the curly hair and her ex-evangelical channel,
I don't want to get too specific.
Okay.
So all right. On that note, good night all, and until next time.